I didn't deserve the doughnuts." Those were the words written in Corey Johnson's final statement, hours after the federal government executed him. Not an apology, not a confession, a complaint about his last meal. January 14th, 2021, Terre Haute, Indiana. 11:34 p.m. Corey Johnson lay strapped to a gurney in the federal execution chamber. At 52 years old, he had spent nearly half his life on death row. The single dose of pentobarbital began flowing through his veins. Within minutes, he was dead. But here's what makes this case so disturbing. Johnson didn't kill once. He didn't kill twice. In just 45 days during the winter of 1992, Corey Johnson and his gang murdered 10 people in Richmond, Virginia. 7 of those victims died by Johnson's hand. Some were rival drug dealers. Others were just in the wrong place at the wrong time. A bodyguard shot in an alley. A man killed for a drug debt. His sister murdered just for being home. Another man killed for answering the door. Johnson's killing spree wasn't about rage or revenge. It was business. Cold, calculated business. He was building a drug empire, and anyone who stood in his way had to die. Before we dive into this story, please like this video and subscribe to our channel, because what you're about to hear is one of the most brutal crime sprees in Virginia history, and it ended with one of the most controversial executions in modern America. This is the story of Corey Johnson, the man who turned Richmond into a war zone. And it all started in the winter of 1992, when a tavern shooting set off a chain of murders that wouldn't stop for 45 days. January 14th, 1992, a tavern in Richmond, Virginia. The place was crowded that night, people drinking, talking, trying to forget their problems. Corey Johnson walked in with 2 members of his gang, James Rohn and another man whose name was never made public. They weren't there to drink. Sitting at the bar was a rival drug dealer named Peyton Johnson. No relation to Corey, just another dealer trying to make money on the same streets. In Richmond's drug trade, that made him a problem that needed solving. Corey didn't waste time with words. He pulled out his gun and fired. Peyton died right there in the tavern, blood pooling on the floor while the crowd scattered in panic. It was quick, it was brutal, and it was just the beginning. Corey Johnson had co-founded a gang called the Newtowne Gang 3 years earlier in 1989. They dealt cocaine in Richmond, moving product through the city's poorest neighborhoods. Business was good, but Corey wanted more. He didn't just want to sell drugs, he wanted to own the streets. That meant eliminating the competition, and Corey Johnson had no problem pulling the trigger. 15 days after killing Peyton Johnson, Corey was ready to strike again. January 29th, 1992, an alley in Richmond. Corey brought 2 of his most trusted gang members with him, Vernon Lance Thomas and James Rohn. They were hunting for a rival drug trafficker, but they couldn't get close. The dealer had protection, a bodyguard named Louis Johnson, so they went after Louis instead. The 3 men cornered Louis in the alley. There was no conversation, no negotiation. Corey, Vernon, and James opened fire. Louis died in that alley, his body left in the dirt like garbage. With the bodyguard dead, the rival dealer was vulnerable. But Corey wasn't done yet. 3 days later, on February 1st, 1992, the killing continued. James Rohn had a problem with a man named Toric Brown. Nobody knows exactly what Brown did to anger Rohn, but in the Newtowne Gang, personal beefs became gang business. Corey Johnson, Vernon Thomas, and James Rohn tracked down Toric Brown. When they found him, his half-sister Martha McCoy was with him. The 3 men attacked. Gunshots echoed through the neighborhood. Toric Brown died on the spot. Martha was shot multiple times, but somehow survived, critically injured, and left to crawl for help. It was February 1st, 1992. The same day Corey killed 3 more people. Later that same evening, Corey Johnson went hunting alone. A man named Bobby Long owed him money. Not a lot of money. Just a debt for drugs that Long couldn't pay back. In most worlds, that means threats, maybe a beating, Maybe Long loses his spot in the drug chain. But Corey Johnson didn't do warnings. He showed up at Bobby Long's house unannounced. Long answered the door, probably thinking he could talk his way out of trouble. He was wrong. Corey pulled his gun and shot Bobby Long dead in his own home. But Corey didn't leave. He walked further into the house. Bobby's sister, Dorothy Armstrong, was there. She had nothing to do with drugs. She wasn't part of the game. She was just visiting her brother. Corey shot her anyway. Then he found Anthony Carter, another man who happened to be at the house that day. Carter didn't deal drugs. He wasn't connected to Bobby's death. He was just there. Corey killed him too. 3 people dead in one house, all on the same day. 2 of them completely innocent. By the end of February 1st, 1992, Corey Johnson had personally murdered 4 people in less than 24 hours. The streets of Richmond were running red, and Corey wasn't slowing down. For 18 days after the triple murder, things were quiet. Too quiet. Corey Johnson started hearing rumors. Whispers on the street that someone in his circle was talking to police. In the drug world, that's a death sentence. The name he kept hearing was Linwood Chiles. Corey suspected Chiles was cooperating with the cops, feeding them information about the Newtowne Gang. On February 19, 1992, Corey arranged a meeting. He told Chiles to bring Curtis Thorne, another man from the neighborhood. 2 sisters, Priscilla and Gwen Green, were also invited. Nobody suspected what was about to happen. They thought this was just another meeting, maybe to discuss business or settle a dispute. Corey brought Richard Tipton with him. The moment everyone gathered, Corey pulled out his gun. He opened fire on all 4 of them. Priscilla and Gwen Green were hit multiple times but survived, critically wounded. Curtis Thorne and Linwood Chiles weren't as lucky. Both men died from gunshot wounds. Corey Johnson had now killed 7 people in 45 days. 7 murders to eliminate competition, settle scores, and silence anyone who might cooperate with police. But he wasn't the only one killing. While Corey Johnson was racking up his body count, other members of the Newtowne Gang were committing their own murders. On January 4th, 1992, before Corey even started his spree, 2 gang members had a problem with a man named Douglas Talley. Talley was an associate who had allegedly mishandled a drug transaction. Richard Tipton and James Rohn took Talley to the south side of Richmond. They didn't shoot him. They stabbed him. 84 times. 84 stab wounds to his head, neck, and upper body. The brutality was unimaginable. 9 days later, on January 13th, 1992, Tipton and Rohn went after another suspected rival named Douglas Moody. Tipton shot him, but Moody managed to run despite his wounds. He didn't get far. Rohn caught up to him and stabbed him 18 times. Moody bled out in the street. In total, the Newtowne Gang murdered 10 people in 45 days. Some sources say 11. Corey Johnson was personally responsible for 7 of them. His gang members killed the rest. By the end of February 1992, Richmond was terrified. Bodies were dropping faster than police could investigate. The streets were controlled by fear, and the Newtowne Gang ruled with violence. But every empire falls eventually. And for Corey Johnson, the walls were about to close in. Police had been investigating the Newtowne Gang for months, but the evidence was hard to gather. People were too scared to talk. Witnesses disappeared. Bodies piled up with no clear suspects. Then someone broke. One of the gang members, either out of guilt or fear, started cooperating with investigators. Names were given. Details emerged. The picture became clear. Corey Johnson, Richard Tipton, and James Rohn were arrested and charged with multiple counts of murder. But this wasn't just a state case. The federal government stepped in. The trio were charged under a federal law that targeted large-scale drug traffickers. This law, enacted in 1988, allowed the death penalty for murders committed to further a drug trafficking operation. Johnson, Tipton, and Rohn were among the first drug dealers ever charged under this law. If convicted, they faced either death or life in prison without parole. The trial began in early 1993. Prosecutors laid out the horror of the 45-day killing spree. Witnesses testified about the shootings, the stabbings, the cold-blooded executions. Corey Johnson sat in court, expressionless, as victim after victim was described in detail. On February 3, 1993, after 17 days of trial, the jury delivered their verdict. Corey Johnson, guilty on all 7 counts of murder. Richard Tipton, guilty of 6 murders, acquitted of 2. James Rohn, guilty of 3 murders, acquitted of 1. The courtroom fell silent. The families of the victims cried. Corey Johnson showed no emotion, but the trial wasn't over. Now the jury had to decide whether these men should live or die. On February 16, 1993, the jury returned with their sentencing recommendations. Corey Johnson, 7 death sentences, 1 for each murder. Richard Tipton, 3 death sentences and 3 life terms. James Rohn, 1 death sentence and 2 life terms. At 24 years old, Corey Johnson became one of the youngest men on federal death row. The district judge officially passed the sentences on June 1, 1993. But what about the other gang members? Vernon Lance Thomas, who helped Corey kill the bodyguard and Torrick Brown, was also tried. He faced a potential death sentence, but prosecutors took it off the table after learning Thomas was intellectually disabled. He was sentenced to life without parole. Sandra Reeves, another gang member, was convicted of conspiracy to traffic cocaine. She got 16 years. 2 other members, Jerry Gators and Sterling Hardy, made deals with the government. They testified against Johnson, Tipton, and Rohn in exchange for lighter sentences. Hardy got 35 years, reduced to 3 years because of his cooperation. Gators got 12 years. The Newtowne Gang was finished. Their leaders were heading to death row, but the legal battles were just beginning. Corey Johnson was transferred to federal death row at the United States Penitentiary in Terre Haute, Indiana. His cell measured 6 feet by 9 feet. Steel bars, concrete walls, no natural light. For 28 years, Johnson lived in that cell, waiting to die. He filed appeal after appeal. His lawyers argued that his childhood trauma and low IQ should have spared him from the death penalty. Johnson had an IQ of 77, just above the legal threshold for intellectual disability. His childhood had been a nightmare. Born in New York City in 1968, Johnson was abused by his mother and her boyfriends. His mother was a drug addict who eventually abandoned him at age 13. He spent his teenage years bouncing between foster care facilities. Johnson couldn't read or write above an elementary school level. His lawyers argued that someone with his level of intellectual functioning shouldn't be executed, but the courts rejected every appeal. The evidence of his guilt was overwhelming. The brutality of his crimes outweighed any mitigating factors. In May 2006, Johnson, Tipton, and Rohn were all scheduled for execution. But a court injunction stopped it at the last minute. After that, federal execution stopped completely. For 17 years, no one was executed by the federal government. Corey Johnson remained on death row, aging, waiting, wondering if he would ever actually face the needle. Then, everything changed. In July 2019, the Trump administration announced it would resume federal executions after a 17-year moratorium. On July 16, 2020, Daniel Lewis Lee, a white supremacist convicted of murdering a family, became the first person executed by the federal government since 2003. After that, the executions came fast. By November 2020, the administration announced 5 more executions scheduled between December 2020 and January 2021. This period coincided with President Trump's final weeks in office after losing the election to Joe Biden. Corey Johnson was the 4th person on that list. His execution date, January 14, 2021. Death penalty opponents were outraged. They called the rush of executions during a presidential transition unprecedented. Critics said Trump was trying to execute as many people as possible before leaving office. Johnson's lawyers filed a clemency petition, begging for his sentence to be commuted to life in prison. The petition was denied. Then, in late December 2020, less than a month before his execution, Corey Johnson tested positive for COVID-19. The federal death row facility in Terre Haute was experiencing a COVID-19 outbreak. Multiple inmates and staff members had tested positive for the virus. Johnson's lawyers immediately filed motions to delay his execution. They argued that COVID-19 could cause lung damage, making the lethal injection process more painful, possibly amounting to torture. A federal judge agreed and granted a stay of execution, but the higher courts overturned it. With a 2-1 majority decision, they ruled that Johnson's execution could proceed. Death penalty opponents were furious. They said the government was rushing to execute people during a pandemic, putting everyone involved at risk. But the government wouldn't be stopped. On January 13, 2021, they executed Lisa Montgomery, the first woman executed by the federal government in 67 years. The next night, it was Corey Johnson's turn. January 14, 2021. Corey Johnson spent his last day on Earth in a small holding cell near the execution chamber. For his last meal, he requested a simple menu: 2 cheeseburgers, fries, a Coke, a strawberry milkshake, and jelly-filled donuts. The prison brought him a pizza and a strawberry milkshake. No cheeseburgers, no fries, no donuts. Johnson ate quietly, thanked the kitchen staff, and told a guard, "Don't let them tell you I did what I didn't." Even in his final hours, there was a hint of denial. But Johnson had confessed to the murders back in 1993. He had been convicted by a jury. The evidence was undeniable. At 11 p.m., guards came to his cell. It was time. Johnson was escorted to the execution chamber. The room was small, clinical, painted white. A gurney sat in the center with leather straps waiting. He was strapped down, arms extended, IV lines inserted. Through the glass window, witnesses watched in silence. Some were family members of the victims. Others were reporters documenting the execution. The warden asked if Johnson had any last words. He declined. At 11:30 p.m., the lethal injection began. A single dose of pentobarbital, a powerful sedative designed to stop the heart and lungs. Johnson's chest rose and fell for a few moments. Then his breathing slowed. Then it stopped. At 11:34 p.m., Corey Johnson was pronounced dead. He was 52 years old. He had spent 28 years on death row, longer than he had lived as a free man. After his execution, prison officials released a written statement from Johnson. In it, he expressed remorse for his actions. He named each of his 7 victims: Peyton Johnson, Lewis Johnson, Torrick Brown, Bobby Long, Dorothy Armstrong, Anthony Carter, Curtis Thorne, and Linwood Childs. Johnson apologized to their families. He said he wished he could take back what he had done in 1992. But then, in a strange twist, Johnson mentioned his last meal. He wrote that the pizza and strawberry shake were wonderful, but he was disappointed that he didn't receive the jelly-filled donuts he had requested. He ended that section with a single sentence: "This should be fixed." Even in death, Corey Johnson found something to complain about. 2 days after Johnson's execution, the federal government executed Dustin Higgs, a man convicted of ordering the murders of 3 women in Maryland. Higgs was the 13th and final person executed during Trump's final months in office. After his death, the execution stopped. President Joe Biden, who took office on January 20, 2021, imposed a moratorium on all federal executions. As of now, that moratorium remains in place. Corey Johnson became the second to last person executed by the federal government. His 2 co-defendants, James Rohn and Richard Tipton, remained on death row. In December 2024, nearly 4 years after Johnson's execution, President Biden commuted the death sentences of 37 federal death row inmates to life without parole. Rohn and Tipton were both on that list. This sparked outrage from the prosecutors, jurors, and investigators who had worked on the Newtowne Gang case. They said all three men deserved the death penalty for the brutal murders they committed in 1992. Federal prosecutor Toby Vick said, Johnson and his gang were particularly violent offenders who deserved the death penalty for all 11 murders. Former Richmond Sheriff C.T. Woody stated, Roan and Tipton should have been executed just like Johnson was. One of the jurors from Johnson's trial, Charles Guthrie, said, The entire jury believed at the time that Johnson, Tipton, and Roan all deserved the death penalty. But the commutation stood. Roan and Tipton will spend the rest of their lives in prison, but they will not be executed. Corey Johnson is the only member of the Newtowne Gang to be put to death by the federal government. Johnson's execution sparked debates that continue to this day. Opponents of the death penalty pointed to his low IQ of 77. They argued that someone with his level of intellectual functioning should not be executed, even if he didn't meet the legal definition of intellectual disability. An autopsy revealed that Johnson likely suffered from pulmonary edema during his execution, a painful condition similar to drowning. Medical experts said fluid rushed up his trachea so quickly that some leaked out of his mouth. Critics said this proved the execution was cruel and unusual punishment, violating the Eighth Amendment. But supporters of the death penalty disagreed. They pointed to the savagery of Johnson's crimes. 7 people murdered in 45 days. 2 innocent victims killed just for being in the wrong house at the wrong time. Prosecutors said Johnson wasn't as intellectually disabled as his lawyers claimed. They pointed out that he co-founded a successful drug trafficking operation, managed multiple gang members, and carried out complex murder plots. 3 years after Johnson's execution, Reverend Bill Breeden, who had counseled Johnson on death row, spoke to USA Today. Breeden described Johnson as a gentle giant who was deeply remorseful for his crimes. With his low intelligence, Johnson should have been excluded from the death penalty, Breeden said. The trauma of witnessing his execution lingers on even after 3 years. The debate over Johnson's execution continues. Was it justice, or was it the execution of a man who never had a fair chance in life? In all the debates about Corey Johnson's IQ, his childhood trauma, and the ethics of the death penalty, it's easy to forget the people who lost their lives in 1992. Peyton Johnson, shot dead in a tavern. Lewis Johnson, gunned down in an alley for being someone's bodyguard. Torek Brown, killed over a personal dispute. Bobby Long, murdered for a drug debt. Dorothy Armstrong, killed for being in her brother's house. Anthony Carter, killed for answering the door. Curtis Thorne, shot for being at the wrong meeting. Linwood Childs, executed for being suspected of talking to police. And the 3 victims killed by Johnson's gang members, Douglas Talley, Douglas Moody, and Torek Brown. 11 people dead, families destroyed, children left without parents, parents forced to bury their children. For the victims' families, Johnson's execution brought some measure of closure. But the pain never truly goes away. One family member said after the execution, "He took our loved one from us 29 years ago. Now he's finally paid for what he did." So, what do we make of Corey Johnson's story? A man born into abuse and neglect, abandoned by his mother at 13, unable to read or write beyond an elementary level, with an IQ just above the legal threshold for intellectual disability. Does that excuse 7 murders? Does it explain the cold-blooded execution of innocent people like Dorothy Armstrong and Anthony Carter? Or was Johnson simply a brutal killer who used his difficult childhood as an excuse? The jurors who sentenced him to death believed he deserved to die. The prosecutors who tried him said his crimes were too heinous to forgive. But others, including the reverend who counseled him on death row, said Johnson was a changed man who should have been spared. In the end, the state made its decision. On January 14, 2021, Corey Johnson was executed for the 7 murders he committed in 1992. His final complaint wasn't about his guilt or innocence. It wasn't about the families he destroyed or the lives he ended. It was about jelly-filled doughnuts he never received. And that perhaps, tells us everything we need to know about Corey Johnson. What do you think? Did Corey Johnson deserve the death penalty, or should his low IQ and traumatic childhood have spared him from execution? Let us know in the comments below. If this story made you think, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more true crime cases that explore the darkest corners of human nature. Like this video and share it to spread awareness about the complex issues surrounding the death penalty. This is True Crime Matters. Thank you for watching.